So for the second topic, I want to talk about existing regulation. And in order to talk about how existing regulations in the US, which, by the way, have generally strong analogs globally, so I'm going to talk mostly about US law, but there's very similar laws in at least the European Union and in many other developed countries. But in order to talk about this existing regulation, we need to talk a little bit about which technologies we're even talking about, because different technologies are going to be regulated differently because they'll either fit or not fit into the definitions of a regulated entity depending on how they're built. So that means talking about permissioned versus permissionless cryptocurrencies and backed stable coin type currencies versus commodity money digital currencies. And I would be remiss to not bring up the elephant in the room, which is this conversation had reached a kind of plateau of agencies that had a piece of jurisdiction here had established their policies pretty clearly. So as I said, CoinCenter's been doing the work we've been doing now for 5 years. Whether it's anti-money laundering law enforced by FinCEN, which is a division of Treasury, whether it's securities laws enforced by the SEC, whether it's money transmission laws, which is state by state, a lot of things had reached a point of stability and actually a good policy outcome. When Facebook decided to launch Libra, there was suddenly a massive amount of renewed interest in digital currencies. And most regulators haven't necessarily changed their opinions, but it's worth noting that Congress has become extremely interested in this technology now. And so members of the House and the Senate who we hadn't even had any interaction with their staffs before were suddenly asking about cryptocurrency or digital currency. And this has all just happened over the last summer. So these topics are now very hot again in DC.
So I noticed, I'm trying to take a picture of you next to David Marcus, and you're standing away.
You're going to send it to David Marcus?
You didn't indulge.
I'm sorry.
Hi, Congresswoman.
And by the way, I think David Marcus did an incredible job in the hearing. I am actually amazed that someone could sit through that much and remain so poised. And his answers were by and large very good. But anyway. So the foundational difference between Bitcoin and Libra is one of permission versus permissionless. We call Bitcoin a permissionless network. I'll explain what I mean by that. I hope it's not a loaded or debatable term, but I'm open to being criticized. And Libra is a permission network. So basically, this is how we sometimes explain, Bitcoin, which is you want PayPal without PayPal. You want a group of sort of, computers on the internet to do all the things that PayPal did: user onboarding, record keeping, management, and to do it in a way that you don't have to trust any one of these participants, and that this set, I've only drawn 4, 5, 6, 7, is actually like an open set. It could be, in theory, much larger than 7. There's no legal or identification type barrier to joining this set. There's all you have to do is be able to calculate SHA-256 really fast, because you're looking for collisions effectively. Or you're not looking for collisions, you're looking for hashes with sufficient zeros at the front. And you need to validate digital signatures. And those are both things that commodity hardware can do. And the software to do that in the way Bitcoin wants you to do that is open source. So free and open software, a computer. Now, to verify signatures, as I said, a commonly available desktop could probably do that. It would take a while for the whole blockchain. In order to actually add blocks. So this is like the read from the blockchain barrier to entry, and this is the write to the blockchain, actually write the block. Barrier to entry, you need purpose-made hardware. You need ASICs at this point. But they are available. It's not like there's one company alone that makes them, and it's not like they're not available on multiple different markets. So this is what we mean by permissionless: free software and commodity hardware. And this could get better. I don't think permissionless is necessarily like a binary term. It'd be great if we could decentralize mining more, so that really anybody with a laptop at home can participate fully in the protocol. And maybe proof of stake, but even then you've got an obvious barrier because you need to be rich in order to stake enough. So, but Questions?
You don't need to be rich? Like anybody in, say, Africa can start mining?
No, absolutely. No. I'm saying proof of stake might make things a little bit better than proof of work. But even with proof of stake, you'll still need to have a lot to stake. So how much can you really participate unless you're rich? At this point, you have to be rich to participate fully in these protocols. But what you're doing is all on an open network, and it's effectively audited by a bunch of people in plain sight. So hopefully that kind of centralization is somewhat mollified by the fact that it's open. But we could say the same thing about permissioned validators as well, if what they're doing is out in the open. Anyway, by permissioned, all I mean is you need software and hardware to participate, but you also need authorization from an organizing authority. That's like a legally cognizable thing. In the case of Libra, it's the Libre Association, which is a nonprofit that's going to be incorporated in Geneva, might already be incorporated in Geneva, I don't know. And so here you go. The Libre Association will launch at some point with a number of members. This is what they've announced so far. I think it's like 28 so far, including themselves, or including Facebook, which is maker of the Calibra wallet. And they plan to launch with 100. So they'll have to get more members. So again, the limit of participation, Bitcoin, yeah, you got to buy a bunch of this stuff. And in proof of stake systems, you've got to actually have a bunch of the coin. But the limit of participation here is you have to get a token, if you will, an authorization of some sort to participate on the blockchain from the association that manages the blockchain. And then the question of stable versus commodity-like digital assets. Bitcoin is valuable because of scarcity. There's just only so much Bitcoin described on the Bitcoin blockchain. At this moment, it's like 17 million units, I think. And the protocol suggests that there'll only ever be 21 million. If everybody who ran Bitcoin software decided that number should change, it would change. So there's an artificiality to the scarcity. But the idea that everyone's going to suddenly hurt their own interests and change that number is something that's sticky. That means that supply is generally stuck. And if there's positive demand, the intersection of the demand curve and the supply curve will set the price. And that's all that sets the price, which means if demand shifts wildly and supply can't adjust, it'll be very volatile. And we've seen that with Bitcoin. With Libra and with other stable coins, the intent is for each unit to be backed by something. If you're familiar with Tether or USDC, and there's several other stable coins, the original intent was often there'll be one unit of national currency for every unit of the stablecoin. Tether used to say, we have $1 for every Tether. The company that issues Tether now says that it's a bundle of assets, including shares of stock in their exchange and some other things that are of questionable value. So Tether has maybe become untethered, I don't know. USDC or Gemini dollars, which is the Winklevoss twins stablecoin project. For Gemini, as an example, they're a New York trust company, and they claim that in their legally incorporated trust that's regulated in New York State, they'll have $1 for every Gemini dollar. And so they control the issuance of the token, and we trust them, or we don't, that they'll only issue a token if they get $1 in the trust.
They control the issuance, but they cannot reduce the money supply.
Although they can destroy.
How would they do it?
So you can destroy units if it depends on the architecture of what you're building. But even if what you're building is something like an ERC20 token on top of Ethereum, you could always burn it. You buy it back from somebody. So you'll have to give up $1, buy it back, and then burn it. You send it to an address that has no possible, or has likely no possible private key that could allow it to be spent in the future. Like a sufficiently non-random public key that it would be impossible to think that someone actually generated the private key to that public key.
As a computer scientist, I have a lot to say about this sentence, but scarcity here is virtual, right? This is
Yes.
The majority of miners can decide to change the number of.
Absolutely.
Just like a different governance, maybe
Well,
the U.S. governance could decide to change the number of dollars.
I mean, it's
Fundamentally, there's no difference here. There's a governing body.
not the majority of miners, though, necessarily.
Necessarily, it is.
It's just the protocol.
It's
so-
the majority of the miners.
Interesting. So I suppose
You can keep your beloved, 21 million.
Yeah.
The majority of the miners are doing something else. They're alone. You have your beliefs.
well, you'd fork. What would happen would be a fork, and you and anyone who goes with you would still have 21 million.
Nobody. Say the majority of the miners in the world decide to change it from 21 million to 22 million.
Right. So users and people who hold a lot. No, users and people who hold a lot, who may not be miners, could say, well, we're not going to change our software, which means their software would now be running incompatible with the miners, which means...
Well, they will. Again, so if the...
Oh, yeah. I'm just saying it's a bigger set than miners. It's a set of all users. Because if anyone maintains a client, whether it's mining or not, that is incompatible with what the miners have decided to do, it will build its own peer-to-peer network if there's a sufficient number of them. They may not be miners, they may just be users. And then ultimately there'll be two assets, assuming there's some critical number on both sides of the fork, and there could not be. So yes, if everyone went to the same restaurant on the same night, there'd be chaos, but they don't. So if there's two forks, there'll potentially be markets in each, as we have seen with things like Ethereum and Ethereum Classic, and Bitcoin and several questionable forks. And then the market will set a price. And that's ultimately the thing that really drives this. So yeah, I could try and convince a bunch of miners to go around and double the amount of Bitcoin in circulation, and we could try and convince the exchanges to list our thing in addition to people who don't want that change. And then what would the market do with that thing? I'm just saying it's a larger problem set than the idea that the miners can unilaterally just change.
It's ultimately the case that the price is going to change such that demand equals supply. This is the way.
Yes, but we're
It's not only the miners, but it's also the demand that comes from the users.
oh,
So
absolutely.
in that sense, it's not different than the other thing. My whole point is that...
But the other thing I
Why
want
will
to say
there be a
something
fork? Majority takes the longest chain and it continues. The 40% cannot...
Well, the majority doesn't have to take the longest chain.
Right, the majority decided to do 22 million.
Yeah,
And then you're doomed. The rest are doomed. Their chain will not survive. I don't understand how you get the fork.
They would just do something else, right? They would not accept
Yeah.
this whatever new protocol is going on.
Right.
Right? Then you would just have two networks.
What?
Yeah. This is not a fork in that there are two long chains and we haven't figured out which is the longest yet. This is a fork wherein the consensus rules of each protocol are irreconcilable, so they don't even talk to each other anymore. And something like changing the ultimate distribution of Bitcoin within the system would violate those consensus rules. Just as we don't, it would basically be a whole new cryptocurrency. Just as we don't think that because,
Make a new cryptocurrency, that's okay.
and that's what these forks ultimately are. I mean, Bitcoin Cash is a brand new cryptocurrency that shares its blockchain up to the fork with Bitcoin. And the proof of work securing the Bitcoin Cash blockchain is tiny compared to the proof of work securing the Bitcoin blockchain, so it's not the longest chain. And yet a bunch of people choose to run software that follows those consensus rules and maintains that as another network.
I mean, ultimately, it's always the demand and supply. Like any object that has value has to be finite, so scarce.
Yes.
If there's infinite supply, the price will always be.
Yes, that's right.
But that's true for anything.
Right. And so again, I mean, Bitcoin is valuable because it's very difficult to change the supply. Not because it's impossible, because it's difficult. And Libra or USDC, the supply is easily changed by design because a company wants to have the power, or a group want to have the power to change the supply to adjust to shifts in demand. And because the product they're putting out into the world is not intended to be a commodity currency, it's intended to be one that is always backed by real assets, rather than just something that's arbitrarily scarce because of a protocol that people find difficult to break, but not possible.
So just a minor needs, to the best of my understanding, Libra is not a stable coin. It is a low volatility coin
Yes.
by virtue of being backed by a non-fractional
Yes.
reserve.
Thank you for pointing that out, because I normally get to that with this slide, but we went in a different direction. So Libra is not like USDC or Gemini that I was describing earlier, where there's in theory $1 for every Libra in circulation. The white paper and so Libra's not even running yet, but the white paper describes a system wherein there will be a bundle of assets that are held by the Libre Association or its partners. And those will be a variety of national currencies like the dollar and the euro, and I think the yen, and also low-risk government debt, so like treasury bonds and things like that. And so one Libra will represent one fractional interest in that bundle of things. So not exactly $1, 0.7 of a dollar, 0.2 of a euro, 0.1 of government bonds and things like that.
But those will stay fixed, or they will
No,
devalue?
so the main point is that the stability is not by decree, it is just by the low volatility of having a non-fractional reserve.
Yes, but the association is allowed with a 2/3 vote to change the composition of the reserve to include new assets or remove assets from that reserve. So
A Bitcoin miner is allowed by a majority vote to change. And if, Libra, we don't like the 2/3 choice, we can, fork Libra. It's the same type of argument.
I disagree, because nothing backs Bitcoin. It's backed by nothing. Whereas Libra has backing. Well, I mean, do miners hold dollars or gold in relation to the amount of Bitcoins they mine? No.
Do miners gain wealth by mining? I think they gain wealth.
Yeah, but they don't have to. They've made no contractual promise or legal promise to hold that wealth in relation to the Bitcoins that they mined. They can alienate it from themselves. Whereas the Libre Association and Gemini and the other folks making stablecoins have made a societal contractual promise to always have sufficient assets on hand such that if someone comes to them with a Libra or a Gemini dollar, they can give them the equivalent of the reserve. I mean, I think, no, I know you're not arguing that, but you said there's no difference. There is a difference in that Bitcoin.
Or changing the policy. So you use this example saying Libra could change, 2/3 of the Libre Association could say, let's now change the dollar to be 0.8 instead of 0.7. That's a reasonable change. Obviously the users, I'll take your stance.
I'm not making.
Users could then say, that fork of Libra, I'm not going to believe it. I like to have a $0.7 back, not $0.8.
Yes.
And so, I'll create my, so that's a forking of Libra.
I think I see where we're disagreeing, and it's maybe not a disagreement, but I might be wrong. I'm not making a normative argument that one of these is better than the other. I'm just making an argument that with Bitcoin, there's nothing backing it. It's numbers on the blockchain of a certain size. And with Libra or Gemini, it's also numbers on a blockchain, but they're making promises to the public that there will be some correlated asset that they will secure that will make that a non-arbitrary number, that will make that a number that has real assets backing it. All I'm saying is that Libra is backed and Bitcoin is not. Now, then you get into the question of value. Okay, then why is Bitcoin valuable if it's not backed by anything? And the only possible answer is because the market judges that there's some, at least temporary, limit on its scarcity. Because if there wasn't, why are people trading it? Are they irrational? I mean, maybe you could say that markets are just fully irrational, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with you when it comes to the cryptocurrency prices. I think they're mostly garbage. And that's why I don't advocate that anyone invest in this stuff, at least not more than you're willing to lose, because this is all crazy technology. Anyway, so there's an implicit assumption you can read in the markets that people don't think the 21 number is changing anytime soon. Because if they did, it's silly. So that's all I mean by scarcity. It is not the scarcity of gold, although, frankly, the scarcity of gold could be put in doubt. Elon could go grab one of those gold asteroids and bring it in, and then we're screwed, right? Or nanotechnology, I don't know, These are just assumptions made by rational economic actors in the economy. And the assumptions made by rational economic actors in the economy are that Bitcoin only has 17 million in circulation right now, and will probably only have 21 million ever. They could be totally wrong. And the assumption that rational economic actors in the economy are making with respect to Libra is that the Libre Association holds 1-to-1 a reserve of which they described, which is the number of dollars, euros, yen, and other things that they said would be proportional to a share of a Libra.
Excuse me. Bitcoin is not backed, and Libra is.
Correct.
How about national currencies? Are they backed or no?
I mean,
They're backed by a central bank. The central bank maintains the value of that investment.
yes, but you cannot, as a U.S. citizen or a foreigner or anyone, go to the central bank and say, I don't want this dollar anymore. I want the real assets that back it up. They're not going to give you anything. They used to, and this was what the gold standard was. But
then, just like the scarcity of Bitcoin, let's say we went back to the gold standard and they did give you a chunk of gold.
right, would it be better? Yeah, it would ruin,
For me, a chunk of gold, then I can't even live.
and it would
Very valuable.
rapidly destroy all of our macroeconomic policies.
So it's all a matter of whether you assign value to something that's scarce or not.
Yes. Cool. I hope this is helpful or fun, at least. I'm having fun. Anyway, this is about the scarcity.
What about the privacy of the Libra? Who is going to see the transactions? You know, Alipay, somebody saw all my transactions. Now in Libra, will some Mark or somebody will see all my transactions?
It's a good question. So as described, the Libra protocol, privacy-wise, looks a lot like Bitcoin, wherein anybody can generate.
Somebody there could see all my transactions.
Yes, but not just Mark Zuckerberg. Anyone. It's very public. Now, Facebook will make the Calibra wallet, which will be how I think most people, at least at first, will interact with the Libra protocol, because it'll be the wallet made by Facebook that will be baked into WhatsApp and the other apps that they hope to have Libra trading on. And they'll have certain proprietary information about who's using that Calibra wallet, which they can then match to the public information on the blockchain. So they'll have a better view, but no better view of Libra necessarily than like a very large exchange on Bitcoin, like Coinbase has, of both the people who are buying Bitcoin on their platform and the public information on the blockchain.
But they have the machinery to analyze and dig into all of this and make some. They probably will use this information, but I suspect it's one of the motivations, if not the main motivation.
I'm sure. I guess I wouldn't presume what their motivations are, but
We're back to the previous talk.
about privacy, about whether Libra is. So
It gives a lot of power to Facebook or somebody there that.
So I wouldn't be ready to just say that it just recreates WeChat and Alipay, because it's still in some ways censorship resistant, because you would have to convince all the members of the Libre Association to block a transaction rather than just having one entity like WeChat capable of blocking a transaction. Anyway, this is probably a more in-depth discussion, so I think maybe I'll move forward. Gold. Baskets. Let's get away from economics, which is kind of like rival religions fighting. It's not really a science. I shouldn't criticize. I don't know. I'm trained as a lawyer. I'm not an economist, but yeah. Anyway, regulations do apply to this technology. A lot of people publish articles, less so lately, but still sometimes, that say like Bitcoin, the unregulated cryptocurrency. The fact of the matter is lots of regulations actually apply to Bitcoin or Gemini dollars or any kind of digital currency. And those regulations are, broadly speaking, anti-money laundering regulations, consumer protection regulations, and investor protection regulations. And within this question of who's the investor protection regulator and what are the investor protection regulations, there's a central question in the US about whether it's the SEC, which is the regulator of securities, a certain type of investment, versus the CFTC, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, which is the regulator of commodities derivatives markets. They don't actually regulate markets for corn, which is a commodity, but they do regulate derivatives markets where people trade futures or swaps, where the underlying value in the contract is some corn to be delivered in the future, for example. So I'll go into some more depth. Anti-money laundering regulations. What do they look like? Well, first of all, in the US, they're federal regulations. So it's the federal government, not the local state governments, that do it. And in the EU, for example, it's something that is done through directive. So all EU member states have to basically have the same AML policy as other member states, and the directives come from the EU. And then in other countries, it's, I mean, the federal provincial distinction, it's almost always done at the federal level, at the top level of government, not through subsidiary governments. It tends to be a registration type regime wherein if you qualify as someone who has to do anti-money laundering things, and I'll describe those in a second, you have to register with the authority. You can't just be in this line of business and not check in with the federal government. You have to register. So they know who you are, and they can then know whether you're doing these things or not. And what are you doing? You're basically doing surveillance for the government. And that's almost an inflammatory way of putting it, because AML is a little bit of a euphemism, anti-money laundering. Like, how can you be against anti-money laundering? Are you pro-money laundering? But AML, it's not anti-money laundering. It's we want to collect a lot of information about financial transactions in the economy and use that information to stop money laundering. It is a surveillance regime at heart. Financial institutions need to know their customers, need to know sometimes who their customers are paying, and if their customers are paying the wrong people, need to stop their customers from paying them. They need to report that information to the federal government. And there are very harsh penalties. I'll just leave it at that. Consumer protection. In the US, for cryptocurrencies, there's no federal consumer protection regulation. It's kind of strange. These things are global by default. They can trade anywhere around the world. And yet, we don't even regulate them at the national level. We regulate them at the state level for protecting consumers from harms. It's a mess. It's a very bad policy. And in the EU, to give some more international color, there isn't really much consumer protection at all at the moment. These things aren't really regulated as financial institutions for consumer protection policies. In the US, it's a state-by-state licensing regime, which means if you qualify as someone who's supposed to do consumer protection for cryptocurrencies, and I'll get into who that might be in a second, it's exchanges is the giveaway. You need to get a license from every state where you have customers, which means you have to get a license from 53 states and territories just to hold other people's Bitcoins in the US, unless you geofence and don't accept customers from the states where you don't have licenses. What are your obligations? This is not a surveillance regime. This is different. This is not AML. This is consumer protection. You need to do a lot of things, like sometimes they want your fingerprints to know that you're not a criminal if you're running this business, holding people's Bitcoins or what have you. You also are going to have to post a bond to prove that you have some sufficient reserves to wind down if you were hacked or went out of business, and maybe a minimum capitalization. So you have to be a big enough company to do this. You can't just be someone who has no assets and decided to hold a bunch of people's Bitcoin and said, trust me. And this also has harsh penalties if you failed a license, which is interesting. And the harsh penalties are enforced by the federal government, weirdly. If you are transmitting money without a license at the state, the federal government can arrest you for being an unlicensed money transmitter. This is actually how they sort of enforce a lot of anti-money laundering law, is by charging you not for money laundering, where you have to prove that they knew they were laundering money, but just charge you as someone who was moving money and wasn't licensed in a state. Because to prove that, you just need to show that they never got the license, whereas to prove money laundering, you have to prove that they actually knew that the money they were moving was proceeds of a crime.
Is there a difference in consumer protection versus standard financial institutions?
Very much so. In Alabama, for example, you can get licensed as a money transmitter by posting a $5,000 bond, generally irrespective of how much money you move for people, which is ridiculous. Whereas if you want to be a bank, you're going to get chartered as a bank, and you're going to have reserve requirements and much more strict audits and a lot more regulation. Now, there might be a reasonable trade-off here, because banks don't just hold people's money, they lend it out. And in theory, a money transmitter is never lending. They're just always holding one for one. You give money to Western Union, to PayPal, they're not supposed to be fractional reserve. They're supposed to just be holding it and then giving it to the person you told them to go. So lower risk profile maybe explains the lower level of regulation. But at the same time, the fact that PayPal can be licensed to transmit money in Alabama by posting a $5,000 bond somehow seems still insufficient. But there are other states like California where you need to post millions of dollars in collateral, basically, to do that. So it's just a mess because it's a state-by-state approach. So finally, investor protection law, which also applies to cryptocurrencies. It is both federal and state-by-state in the US, which means it's extremely complicated. It's permission-based if it's securities regulation. In other words, you're just not allowed to trade in securities as a going concern without basically getting a permission from the SEC. You need to be a national securities exchange or an ATS. If you want to issue a security, and this is where maybe we're talking about other types of persons being regulated in this space, not just people holding people's digital currencies, but people who issue them. If you're issuing a security, you have to effectively get permission from the SEC for doing a public offering, an IPO, which means filing an S1. And let's see, SEC versus CFTC jurisdiction in cryptocurrencies is very unclear. And the reason for this is that some cryptocurrencies seem to fit the definition of a security, and some don't. And the SEC has preeminent jurisdiction over everything that is a security. And the CFTC has jurisdiction over everything that's a commodity, but commodity is drafted so broadly that basically if you fall out of securities, you're going to fall into commodities. So that's the division of labor there, but exactly when something is or isn't a security, as I'll get to in a second, is vague, to say the least.
So there's a fourth category, isn't it? Utility token? Is that a commodity or?
So that's not really law. That's people interpreting the case law about securities and saying because people are using this asset for things, not as an investment, it doesn't fit the definition of security in law. But there's never been a law passed or a regulation made that has defined the term utility token as something distinct. In fact, it's sort of just people using a somewhat lazy shorthand for describing asset that's sufficiently useful that it doesn't seem to be a security under the relevant four-part test.
So as a mathematician, you just told me that if it's not a security, it's automatically a commodity. So that means utility tokens are subject to commodity jurisdiction?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And so are currencies. Some people think that currency is a category here that's distinct. Those are all overlapping. And the main one that matters from a who is the regulator on point here is whether you qualify as a security. And then everything else is generally a commodity. So, as I said, the SEC regulates both promoters and issuers as well as the markets. The CFTC only regulates derivatives markets. They don't regulate the spot market. They don't regulate Coinbase, for example, where people are just trading a Bitcoin for an Ether. If those are both commodities, they would still not regulate that, even though those are both commodities. Where they would regulate is when the Chicago Board of Trade, or CBOE, are making markets in commodities futures. So derivatives contracts where the underlying is the commodity. That's what they regulate. And they don't regulate promoters or issuers because classically and appropriately, there's no issuer of gold. There are just gold miners in the world. And there are people selling gold. No one is the issuer of gold. Whereas a security, Steve Jobs, is the issuer of a share of Apple stock. So this is where you can see the division between commodities and stock. You're just kind of like, you're totally right. You're totally right. It's a mess because miners in Bitcoin are doing something that's kind of like gold mining, but also kind of not. They're also part of this sort of social construct that by virtue of what it's decided in an organic matter has set the amount. So it's a mess, and for the right reasons. These are hard questions to grapple with. And interestingly, there really haven't been this kind of hard question to grapple with before, because it used to be like, yeah, that's some corn. That's not a share of Monsanto. Whereas Bitcoin, yeah, it's kind of a security, but who's the one who's really legally responsible? Is it all the miners together? Is it all the people who wrote the software? Who is it?
Sorry. Related to that, if you use a utility token to do proof of stake, is it a security?
Fortunately, we have 3 cases on it. No, I'm kidding. No, that question might be determined in 10 years.
Can you repeat the question?
If you have a utility token, which again, as I said, is not a real legal thing. It's just somebody's shorthand for a token I don't think fits the definition of security. And you use this utility token to do proof of stake. So it's part of a proof of stake network. If you stake it, you earn returns, which
Become a security, no?
maybe because it's changed in a way. Now it's not just something that is being used. It's something that earns disbursement. Nobody knows. And it's going to be a while because this will have to shuffle out in courts.
So actually, that sounds like you use something which is not as a security to do the investment. Then you get some investment reward. Then it tends to be a security or not, right?
Right. So you're trying to reason by analogy. It's so different, though. It's not like you have corn and you've lent it to someone else, and therefore it's part of a process that secures the network, and then there's fees from people using the network, and you get them because you stake it. I don't think there's anything quite like it, but it definitely does mean that you're earning this regular payment because you have it, which makes it look a little bit more like a security, but in a completely different way. Just like Bitcoin looks a little bit like a commodity and a little bit like a security, but is also something completely different. So again, what I said about earlier, this is not unregulated. This is actually heavily regulated, but nobody has any idea exactly how, because the law is broad and has harsh penalties and doesn't clearly state whether something like Bitcoin would be in or out of one regime or in or out of another regime. And of course it doesn't, because the securities law was written in the Great Depression. The definition of securities hasn't changed much since then. Anyway, one more thing about the CFTC, because everyone wants to talk about the CFTC. It's fun, right? The CFTC has policing authority over spot markets. So if it finds evidence of manipulation at Coinbase or Gemini or what have you, it can still bring action against those spot markets. It just doesn't have supervisory authority, like the SEC has supervisory authority over national securities exchanges, or like the CFTC has supervisory authority over derivatives markets. So there is somebody regulating for manipulation where they find evidence of it, even in commodities spot markets. But they don't get a live data feed from the spot markets to prove manipulation. They have to find evidence of it and then bring action against the spot market.
With any of these regulators control, let's say, because I view in some way when they sell a Picasso for $92 million, to me, a Picasso is, paintings are the Bitcoin currency of the rich. So it's
And lots of money laundering is done with fine art and real estate. But what was the question?
So why, the market of paintings is not controlled by these regulators?
It's a good question. Yeah. So again, the spot markets, you have a Picasso, I want to buy a Picasso, we have a transaction, spot transaction, are not supervised by the CFTC. And so art would kind of be a commodity, except it's non-fungible. So I left out something in the math. Everything that's not a security is a commodity if it's fungible. If it's a unique object, I don't think it fits into the definition. Also, onions aren't commodities because they got a carve out in the law. If you look at the definition of commodity, it says all these things except onions.
Well, it's just a question in English. I don't know what is fungible.
Fungible means one unit is the same as any other unit, whereas a Picasso, of course, is quite special.
Onions are very unique.
They've got layers.
So who's in charge of the onion market?
No one.
No one.
It's chaos. It's very strange. So the spot market and the Picasso wouldn't be regulated, and there aren't liquid derivatives based on underlying Picassos. If there were, and they were trading somewhere, CFTC would regulate that.
But doesn't all this, fascinating and intellectually stimulating as it is, discussion indicate that we simply need new regulations?
Probably, yeah. I think so. But at least in the US and even in Europe now, that happens so slowly. And so these things apply now, and they create liabilities for people doing things with them now that could be enforced. And Europe will probably change faster, but Congress is gridlocked over completely unrelated matters and a political fight that's getting increasingly ugly. So
You can't do new things without kind of relating to the old, right? And you can't just say it's replace the whole law.
right, and I actually think sometimes the way securities laws shuffle out is not so bad. A lot of particularly scammy cryptocurrencies almost certainly do fall into the definition of security, whereas I don't think Bitcoin does. So it's actually very good that then the Securities Exchange Commission is there going after ICOs that are basically just Ponzi schemes. But absolutely, things haven't changed that radically. There's just some new wrinkles that might be deserving of new laws. And we can see how the existing laws apply in the meantime. And maybe okay. So I'm going to go into this. I don't think we're going to get to constitutional law, which is fine, because this has been a great discussion, and I hope it's useful. But if you want to learn about constitutional law of cryptocurrency, I'm always happy to chat with you. And we have that paper, as I said earlier. So this line between commodities and securities is mostly whether you fall into the definition of a security or not. That's the sine qua non of who is your financial regulator. So what is security? What is the definition of security? Well, it basically boils down to two questions that you'd ask about the asset being traded. One, is the asset being sold as an investment? And two, is there a person upon whom investors are relying for the value of that investment? So the intuition here is gold is sold often as an investment, and you don't really rely on anyone for the value of gold. You rely on everyone for the value of gold. A massive market of participants who are buying and selling it, miners who sometimes dig it out of the earth faster, sometimes slower, and users of gold like the scientific research, the dental industry, I guess at one point, although not so much anymore. Like all of this goes into the price of gold. Whereas a share of Apple stock, we really do obviously rely quite centrally on whoever is running Apple, the company, to determine the value of Apple stock. There are markets too, but this person and their board of directors or whoever could issue a whole bunch more shares. They could completely change the strategy of the company in a way that would fundamentally weaken or strengthen the value. They could decide we're not going to make iPhones anymore. We're now a cat cafe business. I don't know. So the two-question token classification exercise we can go through to talk about different cryptocurrencies or ICOs or tokens is this. Why do people want the thing? Do they want it for its usefulness or for its value as an investment? And what's backing up that value? Is it a network of people that's extremely large, like all the people dealing with gold? Or is it really some central person in the system?
Is there a way to define this gap between these network and issuer? Is there a legal term for this? Or?
The efforts of others. Not the efforts of others, because that would, in theory, be everything is dependent on the efforts of others, because we live in a society, damn it. It's been determined as the essential managerial or entrepreneurial efforts of a third party or promoter. So, when the dental industry decided to stop using gold for fillings, it might have hurt the price of gold. Probably not, but it might have. But was any of those persons doing something whose essential managerial efforts change the value? Not really. There's lots of other people that use gold for other purposes, and lots of other reasons that want gold than dental fillings is maybe a way of thinking of it.
So So like if the 15 people who built the GitHub Bitcoin core would just say,
Screw it.
would that be, what would be your assessment of that relative to that statement?
Right. It's hard. My feeling is that because it's open source and because there's actually like some 600 contributors and they've come and gone over the years. In fact, the original person who wrote the protocol just disappeared. That none of those people are doing anything essential. They're doing things that are necessary, but none of them are essential. But I think that's just my opinion, man. You know? And it happens to be the opinion of the relevant regulators in the SEC so far. But also, that's just their opinion. Ultimately, because this is law and a common law-like test for what is a security, the final word would be a judge, and then it would get appealed and appealed, so the final word would be the Supreme Court, if it ever made it there. It would be fun, lots of fun. Not for most people. For me, because I'm perverse and a rent seeker as a lawyer by definition.
I'm waiting for that.
Yeah. So investment versus utility, I guess like this is fairly obvious. It's like if you're putting money into the thing, what are you hoping to get out? More money or like cloud storage? Like Filecoin is one very widely publicized ICO. And in theory, people want it for the storage, but actually a lot of people bought it because they want it, because they think it'll be expensive in the future. And because you can't really go into the minds of every purchaser, because it would be a nightmare as a legal standard, where the courts usually look is, what did the people selling it say? Did they ever say that it would be more valuable? Then they're in trouble. If they really just tried earnestly to say, no, it's really just for use, then maybe they're not in as much trouble. Issuer versus network. Again, like PayPal works because of some essential managerial efforts. Bitcoin, I would argue, although this is just my opinion, works because of an unlimited set of participants doing public key crypto, blockchain, and competing to mine, and the software that allows them to do that. I think that's a network, not an issuer, but this is law, not science, not math. Again, like Amazon with cloud storage versus a network of people providing cloud storage through something like IPFS and Filecoin. Maybe it's a network and not an issuer, but I don't know. So now that we have this two-question classification exercise for tokens, we can graph things, kind of, in a really sloppy, non-scientific way. So on the x-axis, I'm going to put, or on the y-axis, I'm going to put, why is this thing valuable? Is it useful, or is it an investment? Because it's definitely a continuum. It's not like one, like some people use gold. Most people just want it for value. And here, I'm going to put network versus issuer. What creates the value? Because this is also a continuum. In some cases, it's really just one guy. In some cases, it's everyone. And there's people in the middle. So this, I think, is useful. And this is actually how the case law for securities works. So, you know, Tim Cook is definitely up here with shares of Apple stock, right? People buy Apple stock for money. They don't take their certificate and like try and make paper airplanes out of it or something like that. And it really is Tim Cook and his board of directors, and that's what people are relying upon. Over here, and maybe it's actually a little bit higher because most people don't use gold, but some people do, would be gold. There's really just a massive number of people who dig gold out of the earth, and so it's there. This might be things like oil and real estate. Up here are like member-run corporations. It's kind of interesting, like where everybody who co-owns the venture is also doing what the venture does. And these things are actually traditionally not securities, just like commodities are not securities. Yeah, all the co-owners are there for investment, but they're part of the network. You know, like they're there. They are the ones they rely on. They're not relying on some third party. And then down here are things like loyalty cards and golf course memberships. Like, you want it for its usefulness. You want to play golf. But you're relying on whoever owns the golf course to not issue too many memberships, because then the golf course gets crowded or just, you're relying on the guy who owns the golf course to not stop cutting the grass, because that would be a weird game of golf if it was really long grass. I've never played golf, but I'm assuming you can't play golf if the grass gets too tall. Theater tickets might be here, because it's a bigger group of people that make a concert like worthwhile, but maybe they'd actually just be here, I don't know. And this is interesting. This is like warehouse receipts for some valuable item. And I put this here because I put all of these things here because there are case law about these things pre-cryptocurrency. So there's case law that says that a fancy apartment in Manhattan, even if people generally actually expect an investment return, the fact that you can live in it is what makes it not a security. There's a case about golf course memberships where somebody said, most people just want a membership because they want to golf. And that's why it's not a security, even though you're relying on this person. But there's another case, I think in New Jersey, might be some Trump ancestor maybe, where somebody was promising future golf courses that were great, like tremendous golf course. And they were pre-selling memberships to the golf course to raise money to build it. And the court said, actually, this is not a golf course in the traditional quadrant here. It's actually like up here, because people are expecting a return. And now there are tokens that do all of these things. And so actually we have a lot of great case law. Maybe we don't need to change the law. It's not satisfying to technologists, though, because, there's case law that will influence the court when they come for your technology. And maybe you'll be OK. It's very different than saying, like, you were regulated by this, not this. But there is a lot of good case law that could ultimately make that determination, but it would shuffle out some way. And this one is interesting to me in light of our stablecoin conversation, in that the cases here are about receipts. You have this receipt, and you can go to the person who gave you the receipt and get something. And the cases where these receipts were securities were ones where, there's one about whiskey barrels, where a guy was like, here's a receipt. You own the whiskey barrel. I'm going to hold it for you, and I'm going to age it in my warehouse. And as it gets better with age, because that's how whiskey works, you'll be able to make money in the long run when you come back and get your whiskey barrel from me. Or what is more likely to happen, I will sell your whiskey barrel and give you the profits when you want to get out, because you're not going to actually bring a truck up to the warehouse and carry a multi-500-pound barrel. So that was a security. But at the same time, having some legal document that entitles you to assets in a trust is not a security. It's just custody of something. And when you give your car to the mechanic to be repaired, and he's holding it for you, and you've got a receipt, it's just called a bailment in law. You still own the car. They're just holding it for you. The receipt is not a security. It's just evidence of your continued ownership and their temporary custody of it. So there's a whole range of things here. And those are the relevant cases for things like stablecoins. Where this becomes tricky is some of them are more like you get $1 if you have a USDC. What we were talking about with Libra, there is some active management of the assets that the receipt represents. 2/3 can vote to change what the receipt represents. So does that make it more like an investment vehicle? Because there's somebody who you're relying on to keep the investment strong? Maybe. But this is, again, non-determinative. It's just indicia. And so, this is, I've never seen anyone else do this graph, but this is pretty much how the case law works. And so if we were to graph what is the SEC's jurisdiction, this is probably something like this. But it could be more like that. It could be narrow. And so we don't know yet. We'll find out. I think I'll stop there. Because hopefully this has been helpful, and we're coming close to time, and maybe we can take a couple questions.
Sounds great. Thank you, Peter.
So I guess I'll ask again. So when it came to this hour, the second hour, and regulations, it seems like you mostly concentrated again on national
Yes.
scope. But when it comes to cryptocurrencies, the whole point is that it is international and goes beyond national scope.
Unfortunately, it's a pragmatic focus because I don't see the global nations giving up their sovereignty to protect their own citizens to a global body. And so until that day happens, it is national laws that will apply. And that is really, I'll admit, very bad for the technology, because how can you run something when you're subject to the laws of every nation where you have users? It's a nightmare. And maybe that's more than anything else, more than any technical problems, why the banking system has remained as fragmented as it has, and why the payment systems have remained as fragmented as they are. And maybe that's the only reason why Bitcoin has gained a little bit of traction, is because it's finally created a system that, yes, it's subject to the laws of every jurisdiction, but it is powered by a bunch of people rather than one person who could get hauled in front of every jurisdiction.
So is one way to look at it is a little bit, you know, we have the internet. The internet is international, and it facilitates all sorts of transactions, business interactions.
Right.
But it just carries bits internationally.
Right.
At some point, you know, the service providers, the people who are actually building applications, are the ones who are subject to local jurisdiction. Is there some analogy?
That would be a sensible way to do it then, right? Because the internet has generally managed to work despite being global and there being several regulators. The problem is, the reason why I think that worked in large part is because the activity described is not one that was regulated before in almost any country at all. In fact, in the US, if you try to aggressively regulate that activity, which is just moving data from one person to another, you can't do that. You can't put a regulation in place because it would be an impediment to free speech, which, again, we've got a paper on constitutional law here, which is interesting. Whereas the activity within payment systems is one that involves trust and fiduciary responsibility to not lose other people's money. And that is one that is regulated everywhere and always was. So whereas the internet just had to fall into the lacuna of every nation actually doesn't regulate this, so it's okay if you're regulated by every nation, anything dealing with holding other people's money, if you're doing it on a global scale, it's already regulated in all those nations. And so you're going to have to find a way through that. And people argue this. People say, like, Bitcoin shouldn't be regulated at all because the transaction messages on Bitcoin are just speech. They're just data being moved around. But we know it's extremely consequential data. And so even despite my more civil libertarian prejudices that I evinced in the first hour, I wouldn't go that far. I wouldn't say that like a Bitcoin transaction message is speech and therefore can never be regulated. I think it's naive and probably wrong.
So I guess I'm getting the idea that securities are defined by this upper right quadrant and whatever. But what is the reason that that's how it's defined? My naive guess would be, for example, you care about it having an issuer versus a network because then there's someone to blame or something like that?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Reasons like that on why the axes exist.
So the securities regulations evolved again in the Great Depression in the US, and then most international securities regulations just carbon copied that from the US with some differences that actually make their application narrower, which is why I think you've seen a lot of ICOs move to Switzerland and places like that. They evolved for the specific purpose of addressing what economists would call information asymmetries that exist between the promoter and the people who buy things, relying on the knowledge and efforts of the promoter. They basically said, like, it's okay if you're convincing people to invest in a thing and they're relying on you. That's fine. We don't want to stop capital markets from forming. In fact, the SEC has a dual mandate: protect investors and make for efficient capital markets. But if you're going to be a trusted person, you're going to have unique information. Like, this person knows how many shares they're going to issue. And they know a lot of other things. And they also have a history. And the SEC is there to make sure that when they issue something, they make disclosures of all that information. And so that's why they have to file an S1. Now, inadvertently, because once it's a security, you fall under the securities regulations, that also means that if it's a security, it can't trade on places like Coinbase, because the Securities Exchange also regulates national securities exchanges and ATSs, and only allows a set number of participants to become ATSs or securities exchanges, and has never allowed any cryptocurrency companies to be those exchanges. So this classification as a security seems rational in some cases for a cryptocurrency where you really are reliant on the efforts of a few, but it would also destroy the viability of the cryptocurrency because there'd be no markets that trade it. And because individual use of it would be bogged down in a lot of compliance. It'd be as difficult to dispense of a security digital currency as it is to dispense of a share of Apple stock. And that makes it hard to work as a currency. We can talk more specifically offline about why, but so this is another mismatch. Like, maybe we could have some kind of securities-like regime where disclosures are made, but it can still trade on markets that aren't securities exchanges, because otherwise it would just die. But that would be new law. Cool. Thank you, guys.
Thanks a lot.